The word hit Hester Hawkins like a fist to the sternum, and the world tilted sideways before she could stop it. She had been standing in the middle of Callaway's General Store in Redrock, Texas, on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1882, reaching for a sack of flour on the middle shelf when she heard him. The voice of Gerald Prout, the man she had trusted with her father's land deed, the man she had believed was helping her navigate the legal labyrinth of a contested estate, speaking in low, conspiratorial tones just beyond the bolts of calico fabric that served as a dividing curtain in the store's back corner. "She does not suspect a thing," Gerald was saying. "By the time that woman figures out what I have filed at the county seat, the land will already be in Caldwell's name, and there is not a judge west of the Pecos who will unwind it for her." The flour sack slipped from Hester's fingers. It struck the plank floor with a soft, devastating thud. The blood drained from her face in one long, slow tide. She had been living on $4 and the promise of that land since her father, Thomas Hawkins, had died of a chest infection 3 months prior. She had no husband, no brothers, no male guardian to stand before the law on her behalf in a territory where a woman's word counted for roughly as much as smoke. She had trusted Gerald Prout because he had been her father's acquaintance, because he had appeared at her door with condolences and a folder of papers and a practiced expression of sympathy. She had signed things. God help her, she had signed things she did not fully understand because he had told her they were formalities. Betrayal. The word rose up inside her chest like floodwater, and there was no dam left to hold it. The edges of her vision began to darken, not dramatically, not with any theatrical flourish, but in the quiet, certain way of a candle being smothered under a glass. She heard Gerald say something else, heard a second voice murmur an affirmation, and then the floor rushed upward to meet her, and there was nothing at all. She did not know, in those blank seconds of unconsciousness, that Marshal David Hadley had just walked through the front door of Callaway's General Store. She did not know that he had caught her before her head struck the floorboards. She did not know that he had stood in that store for a full 3 minutes, looking down at her pale face against his arm and felt something shift permanently inside him. She would learn all of it later. She would learn a great deal later. But first there was the darkness, and then, slowly, the light. 3 months earlier, Hester Hawkins had arrived in Redrock, Texas, by stagecoach from San Antonio, carrying 2 carpetbags and the knowledge that her father was dying. Thomas Hawkins had homesteaded his land outside Redrock 11 years before, during the early swell of settlement that followed the end of the war. He had built a house, broken ground on 40 acres, kept cattle, and corresponded with his daughter in letters so regular and warm that Hester had been able to picture the sound of his voice, even during the 6 years she had spent working as a schoolteacher in San Antonio. She was 26 years old when she buried him, and she had cried at the grave with the specific, hollow grief of someone who knows that the last person in the world who loved them unconditionally is now underground. The land was all that remained. 40 acres of scrubland and mesquite with a house on it, a well, a small barn, and the memory of her father moving through it. The deed was in a tin box under the floorboards of the bedroom, and Gerald Prout had found her at the funeral and offered his services with such gentle professionalism that she had been grateful. He was a land agent, he explained. He had helped a dozen settlers in the county navigate inheritance procedures. The territorial laws were complicated for a woman in her position. He could smooth the process. She had let him. And now she was unconscious on the floor of Callaway's General Store with a stranger's arms around her. David Hadley was 31 years old, and he had been the Marshal of Redrock for 2 years. He had come from Abilene originally, had spent 3 years as a deputy in Fort Worth before taking the star in Redrock when the previous Marshal, a man named Cole Vantage, had been shot dead in a dispute over water rights. David was tall without being dramatic about it, broad across the shoulders in a way that came from labor rather than vanity, and he had dark eyes that had seen enough violence to make them careful. He did not speak quickly, did not draw his gun quickly, did not trust quickly, but when he made up his mind about something, he did not change it easily either. He had not made up his mind about Hester Hawkins yet. But he had seen something in her face in the 2 seconds between when she fell and when he caught her, some expression of devastation so raw and so unguarded that it had gotten under his ribs in a way he could not entirely explain. He knelt on the floor of Calloway's general store with her head cradled against his arm, and old August Calloway came around the counter wiping his hands on his apron, clucking with concern, and a woman buying thread in the corner let out a small shriek and then clapped a hand over her mouth. "She lives out on the Hawkins place," Calloway said, peering down. "Thomas Hawkins's girl. Been coming in every week since Thomas passed. Always alone." He said the word alone with a particular weight that David understood. "Get me a wet cloth," David said. Calloway got it. David pressed the damp linen to Hester's forehead and watched her eyelashes flutter. She had dark brown hair coiled at the back of her neck and a quality of stillness in her features, even unconscious, that made her look like someone who was accustomed to holding herself together with both hands. There was a flour sack on the floor beside them, which told him she had dropped it when she fell, and something about that small domestic detail made the whole scene feel more urgent, more real. Her eyes opened. They were gray, he noticed. Not blue-gray or green-gray, but a clean, serious gray, like winter sky before rain. She looked up at him, and for one disoriented second there was nothing in her face but pure confusion, and then the awareness came back behind her eyes like a tide, and with it came something worse. He watched her remember, watched the knowledge of what she had heard settle back onto her features like a sentence being handed down. "Easy," he said. "You are safe. You fell." She sat up too quickly, which he had anticipated, and he kept a hand at her back to steady her. "I did not fall," she said, and her voice was steadier than he expected from someone who had just regained consciousness. "I fainted. There is a distinction." "There is," he agreed. "Can you tell me your name?" "You know my name," she said, and looked at Calloway, who nodded slightly in confirmation. "Hester Hawkins, and you are the Marshal." "David Hadley," he said. "How long since you last ate?" She opened her mouth, and the smallest pause before she answered told him everything. "This morning," she said. It was mid-afternoon. He suspected this morning meant something small, something insufficient, something that a woman running out of money and trying not to admit it would call a meal. "I am going to take you home," he said. "That is entirely unnecessary," she said. "You just fainted in a general store, Miss Hawkins. The floor is not a safe place for you to be." "I am on my feet now," she pointed out, and she was, or nearly so, because she had gotten herself upright during their exchange, though she was gripping the shelf beside her with a subtlety that he noticed, and she clearly hoped he would not. "I am still taking you home," he said. "You can argue with me about it on the way." She argued with him about it on the way, which he did not mind. Her horse and buckboard were tied outside the store, and he helped her up onto the seat, tied his own horse to the back, and drove her the 2 miles out along the creek road to the Hawkins place. She spent the first mile telling him she was perfectly capable of managing herself, which he believed, and the second mile telling him about the land and the deed and Gerald Prout. He had not asked her about Gerald Prout. She told him anyway, in the clipped, precise way of someone who has been holding a secret for so long that the moment they begin to release it, it comes out all at once. She told him about the papers she had signed. She told him what she had overheard in the store. She told him about the 40 acres and the tin box under the bedroom floorboards and her father's 11 years of labor. By the time they reached the Hawkins place, David Hadley had stopped thinking about whether this was his concern and had simply accepted that it was. The Hawkins house was modest but solid. Thomas Hawkins had built well. The walls were thick limestone, the roof sound, the porch level. There was a kitchen garden beside the house that had gone slightly to weeds in the months since Thomas's death, and a windmill that creaked in the afternoon breeze with a sound like slow clockwork. It was the kind of property that a man like Caldwell, whoever Caldwell was, would want very much. David helped Hester down from the buckboard, and she let him, which told him the faint had taken more out of her than she was admitting. Inside, he built up the fire in the kitchen stove without being asked, while she retrieved the tin box from under the bedroom floorboards and spread the documents on the kitchen table. He looked at them while the fire caught, and what he saw confirmed what she had described. Among the papers she had signed was a document that, in language deliberately buried in formality and repetition, appeared to transfer certain rights of claim to a party described as Gerald Pruitt and Associates pending legal resolution. It was a trap. It had been designed to look like a procedural formality and was instead a net. He was not a lawyer, but he had been a lawman long enough to recognize the architecture of a fraud. "You need an attorney," he said. "I cannot afford an attorney," she said, without any self-pity, just the flat acknowledgement of a fact. "There is a man in Laredo named Marcus Webb," David said. "He is honest, which is not universal among his profession, and he has dealt with land fraud before. I know him. I will write to him tonight." She looked at him across the kitchen table, and he could see her deciding how much to trust him. He did not rush her. He had learned that trust was not a thing you could hurry without breaking it. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "Because what was done to you is wrong," he said, "and because that is my job. Writing letters is your job. Protecting people is my job," he said, and the simplicity of it seemed to reach her because something in her expression shifted very slightly. Not much, but enough. He stayed for 2 more hours that first evening. He helped her carry water from the well, because the bucket rope was frayed and he did not want her relying on it alone, and he looked at the latch on the front door, which was loose, and fixed it with a nail he found in the barn. He did not make any of this into a production. He simply noticed things that needed doing and did them quietly, without commentary, and Hester Hawkins watched him do it with an expression that moved through wariness and into something softer that she did not yet have a name for. When he left, he said he would return the following morning to check on her. She told him she would be fine. He said he believed her and he would check anyway. She almost smiled, which she stopped. He rode back to Redrock in the blue dusk, with the sound of the windmill still in his ears, and the image of her gray eyes following him all the way to town. He wrote the letter to Marcus Webb that same night, sitting at the small desk in his office behind the jail, with the smell of coal oil from the lamp and the distant sound of the saloon down the street. He wrote carefully, laying out the specifics of what Hester had described and what he had observed in the documents, and asked Webb to come as soon as he was able. He did not ask as a favor. He asked as one honest man to another, for the sake of a woman who had been wronged and who had no one else standing in the gap. He went back the next morning. He told himself it was professional concern, which was partially true. He told himself she was a vulnerable single woman in an isolated property who had fainted the previous day, which was also true. He did not fully examine the third reason, which lived in the back of his mind like a persistent and inconvenient light, until much later. She was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, pulling weeds with a focused, economical energy that made it clear she had been at it for some time. She looked up when she heard the horse, and her face did not do anything dramatic, did not light up or fall, simply registered his arrival with the neutral attentiveness she seemed to bring to everything. "Marshal," she said. "Miss Hawkins," he said. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she said. "Embarrassed. About fainting. About being overheard when it happened," she said, with a dryness that surprised a brief sound out of him that was almost a laugh. He helped her with the garden for an hour. She did not ask him to, and she did not protest when he began to pull weeds alongside her, just moved to the next row and left the one beside him free. They worked in a companionable quiet that he had not expected to feel natural with someone he had met the previous day, but it did. She asked him after a while where he had been before Redrock, and he told her about Fort Worth and Abilene, and she told him about San Antonio and the school where she had taught 2nd and 3rd grade for 6 years, and he found himself asking questions he would not normally ask, not out of polite conversational obligation, but because he genuinely wanted to know the answers. She was precise about things. She had a way of choosing her words that suggested she had considered several options and selected the most accurate one, which was a quality he respected. She was not fragile. He had understood this from the moment she had sat up on the floor of the store and told him there was a distinction between falling and fainting. But there were moments when the careful competence slipped slightly, when she looked out across the 40 acres with an expression that was too quiet for equanimity and too still for peace. And he recognized grief when he saw it, recognized the particular way a person looks when they are trying to outwork the feeling that keeps catching them. He returned on the third morning and the fourth. By the fifth morning, she had started a pot of coffee before he arrived, and when he noted it, she said she had been making coffee anyway, and it made no sense to brew only one cup. He accepted this explanation with the seriousness it deserved. Gerald Prout came to the Hawkins place on the sixth morning. David was not there when it happened. He arrived 2 hours later and found Hester standing on the porch with her arms crossed, and an expression on her face that was controlled in a way that required visible effort. She told him Prout had come to encourage her to accept an offer from Caldwell for the property, had called it a generous settlement, had implied with the genteel menace of a man accustomed to dealing with women alone that her legal position was hopeless, and her best outcome was to take what was being offered and leave. "What did you tell him?" David asked. "I told him to get off my father's land," Hester said. He nodded once, with a completeness that communicated more than a longer reply would have. "Good," he said. He rode into town that afternoon and had a conversation with Gerald Prout that was short, direct, and entirely civil in its surface, and that left Gerald Prout with the clear and accurate understanding that the Marshal of Redrock was not unaware of the situation involving the Hawkins land claim. He did not threaten. He did not posture. He simply made clear, in the quiet, unambiguous way of a man who does not need to raise his voice to be taken seriously, that the legal process would be observed, and that any attempt to shortcut it would be observed as well. Gerald Prout smiled and said of course, and that there was no question of impropriety, and that he had always had Miss Hawkins's best interests at heart. David looked at him for a moment and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said, and then he walked out. Marcus Webb arrived from Laredo 11 days after David sent the letter, which was faster than David had expected, and suggested that Webb had taken the situation seriously. He was a compact, sandy-haired man of about 40, with reading spectacles he kept folded in his breast pocket, and a manner that was direct without being brusque. He sat at Hester's kitchen table for 2 hours reviewing the documents, asking occasional precise questions, and then he set down his spectacles and told her what he had found. The document she had signed was what he called a fraudulent assignment. It had been constructed to appear as a temporary procedural measure, but contained language that, under a certain reading of territorial law, could be interpreted as a voluntary transfer of claim. However, he said, it had been signed under false pretenses and with deliberate concealment of its true nature, and there was a legal principle, still being developed in territorial courts, but with precedent in several eastern jurisdictions, that held such documents voidable on grounds of fraudulent inducement. He believed, with reasonable confidence, that he could get it thrown out. He also told her that the document had already been filed at the county seat, as she had overheard Gerald say it would be, and that a man named Franklin Caldwell had already submitted a purchase offer through the Territorial Land Office based on that filing. Moving quickly was essential. Hester listened to all of this with her hands flat on the table and her face composed, and David, sitting across the room against the wall, watched her absorb each piece of information with a steadiness that he found quietly remarkable. When Webb finished, she asked 3 questions that were exactly the right 3 questions, and Webb answered them, and then she said she would like to retain his services and asked what his fee was. Webb told her. It was not a small number. He watched her face calculate rapidly and then hold still. "Half now," she said, "and half when the matter is resolved." "That is acceptable," Webb said. "I have the money in the tin box," she said. "Give me a moment." She left the room. Webb looked at David. David looked at the window. Webb, who was an observant man, allowed himself a small private expression and then smoothed it away before Hester returned with the bills counted out and folded precisely. Over the following weeks, the legal battle over the Hawkins land claim proceeded through the slow, grinding machinery of territorial law, and David Hadley found himself riding out to the Hawkins place nearly every morning. He told himself, and occasionally told others when asked, that he was keeping an eye on the situation because there was a legitimate concern about harassment or intimidation by parties with an interest in the land. This was true. Franklin Caldwell was a man with money and connections in the territory, and men like that did not accept legal setbacks gracefully. There had already been one instance of someone cutting the fence along the northern edge of the property, which might have been an accident but was almost certainly not, and a second incident in which one of Hester's cows had been found dead in the creek, which was unexplained. But the professional concern, while genuine, was not the whole truth of why David rode that creek road every morning, and he knew it. He had begun to look forward to the sight of the Hawkins place in the early morning light with a specificity that had nothing to do with professional vigilance. He had begun to know the sound of her voice well enough to hear when she was tired versus when she was troubled, and to understand the difference between the kind of quiet she fell into when she was thinking and the kind that meant she was fighting something back. He had begun to carry particular pieces of information through his days, observations and small details about her that he turned over in his mind not because they were relevant to anything, but because they interested him in a way that nothing had interested him in a long time. She had noticed him too, though she was careful about it in the way she was careful about most things. On the morning 3 weeks after Marcus Webb's arrival, she had offered him not just coffee but breakfast, which was a different category of gesture entirely, and they had sat across from each other at the kitchen table, with the morning light coming through the window and eggs and biscuits between them, and talked for an hour about things that had nothing to do with land deeds or fraudulent assignments. She told him about a book she had been reading, a novel that had come by mail order from a publisher in New York, and about the way certain passages had struck her as more honest about loneliness than most things she had read. He told her about a summer he had spent as a young man working on a cattle drive before he had gone into law work, about the way the plains looked at night under a full moon, and she had listened with the complete attention she brought to things that genuinely interested her, and he had found himself talking longer than he intended, because she listened in a way that made talking feel worthwhile. He rode back to town that morning aware that something had moved in him, that the careful, reasonable distance he had been maintaining was no longer entirely where he had left it. The second threat from Caldwell's people came at the end of the 4th week. This time it was direct. A man came to the Hawkins place in the early evening, a large, rough-edged man named Dorsey who worked for Caldwell as a kind of enforcer, and told Hester that Mr. Caldwell was prepared to make the process very unpleasant for her if she continued to refuse the settlement offer. He did not say this violently. He said it in the measured, almost polite tone of someone who has delivered this kind of message many times and knows that the measured tone is more frightening than shouting. Hester did not show that it frightened her, though it did. She told Dorsey he could take his message back to Caldwell and tell him that her answer had not changed. Dorsey looked at the house, looked at her, and left without saying anything else. She told David about it the next morning, not with panic but with the focused urgency of someone who understands that a situation is escalating. He did not underestimate it. He rode out to the Caldwell operation, which was a large cattle ranch 7 miles east of town, and he had a conversation with Franklin Caldwell himself. Caldwell was a man in his 50s, silver-haired and expensively dressed in a way that was slightly out of place with the frontier, but communicated clearly that he considered himself above it. He received David with the slightly contemptuous courtesy of a man who regards local law enforcement as a minor inconvenience. David told him, clearly and without embellishment, that any further intimidation of Miss Hester Hawkins of the Hawkins homestead would be considered obstruction of a legal proceeding and would be treated accordingly. He told him that Dorsey's visit had been noted and documented. He told him that the Marshal's office of Redrock was aware of the entire situation regarding the fraudulent land assignment and was watching it closely. Caldwell smiled thinly and said he had no idea what David was referring to, that Gerald Prout acted as a free agent, and that any business Prout conducted was not his responsibility. David looked at him for a long moment and said that was interesting and that he hoped it would continue to be the case, and that Mr. Caldwell would want to ensure his employees understood the same position. Then he left. He did not know if it would hold. Men like Caldwell did not respond to warning the way ordinary people did, but he knew the situation had been named out loud in a context that could not be denied, and that mattered. What mattered more was what happened when he rode back to Redrock and found himself thinking not about Caldwell or Prout or the legal proceedings, but about the way Hester had described Dorsey's visit that morning. The faint tremor in her voice that she had controlled before it became audible, but that he had heard anyway. The smallest possible tell in a woman who was very good at not showing fear, and the way something hot and protective had moved through him at the sound of it. He stopped on the creek road and looked at the sky for a moment, and then he accepted, quietly and without ceremony, that he was falling in love with Hester Hawkins, and that the process was already too advanced to reverse. The legal proceedings moved forward through Marcus Webb's capable hands. Webb filed a challenge to the fraudulent assignment at the county seat in mid-April, documenting the material misrepresentations Prout had made and the deliberate concealment of the document's true effect. He also filed a separate complaint with the Territorial Land Office regarding the improper purchase offer that Caldwell had submitted, arguing that it was based on a filing that was itself under legal challenge. Hester went to the county seat with Webb at the end of April to provide a sworn statement about her interactions with Prout and the circumstances under which she had signed the documents. David rode with them, not because he had been asked to, but because he was not willing to let her make the journey without someone reliable beside her. She accepted his presence without comment, which he had come to understand was her way of accepting things she was grateful for without making the gratitude into a vulnerability. The county seat was a full day's ride from Redrock. They rode out before dawn and reached it by mid-morning, and Hester gave her statement to the court clerk with a clarity and precision that David suspected left the clerk somewhat daunted, and then they had lunch at a small establishment near the courthouse and rode back. The hours on horseback traveling together provided a different quality of conversation than the kitchen table mornings, somehow more open, perhaps because movement makes certain kinds of honesty easier. She asked him, somewhere in the long afternoon of the return ride, why he had stayed in Redrock. He thought about it. It needed someone, he said. Most places need someone, she said. This one felt like mine, he said, and then, after a moment, I did not have somewhere else that felt that way. She was quiet for a while after that. The horses moved at an easy pace in the long light. The mesquite and the dried grass stretched out on either side, and overhead the sky was the particular deep blue of a Texas evening coming in, full of depth and silence. I understand that feeling, she said finally. I thought San Antonio was mine because it was where I had built something. But when my father was dying, I rode the stage here and I came around the bend where you can see the valley and the creek, and I thought, no, this is it. This is where it was all along. She paused. Which makes the situation with the land somewhat more urgent than it might otherwise be. We are going to keep it, he said. She looked at him. You cannot promise that. No, he said. But I am telling you what I believe." She held his gaze for a moment, and something passed between them in that look, something wordless and significant that neither of them tried to name. "Thank you, David," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. She seemed to notice it at the same moment he did, and there was a brief, charged pause, and then she looked forward again at the road, and so did he, and neither of them said anything else about it. But the road back to Redrock felt different from the road out. Gerald Prout attempted to flee. It happened in early May, when the legal situation had deteriorated badly for Prout, and the evidence of fraud had become impossible to dismiss. David was informed by a writer from the county seat that the challenge had been upheld at preliminary hearing, and that the fraudulent assignment had been suspended pending a full hearing, and that Prout had been named in the complaint as a material party. 2 days later, one of David's informants in town told him that Prout had been seen loading his horse with significant supplies and asking about the road south to Mexico. David caught him on the road 8 miles south of Redrock before noon. The conversation was brief. Prout was returned to Redrock. He was not treated roughly, because David did not work that way, but he was very clearly informed that leaving the territory while named in a legal proceeding was not something that was going to happen without consequences. Prout was visibly frightened, which told David that Caldwell had likely withdrawn his support the moment the legal challenge succeeded, leaving Prout alone with the consequences of a scheme he had operated on Caldwell's behalf. David put Prout in a cell overnight, charged with attempted flight to avoid legal proceedings, and sent a wire to the county seat. He told Hester about it that evening. He rode out to the Hawkins place in the early dusk, which was not his usual morning habit, but the day had been long, and he found that the place at the end of it where he most wanted to be was here, on this porch, with this woman. He told himself he was updating her on developments in the case. He was also doing that. She was sitting on the porch steps with a cup of tea when he arrived, and she looked up at him with that level, appraising look as he tied the horse to the post. He told her about Prout. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she let out a slow breath that was not quite a sigh. "What happens now?" she asked. "The full hearing is scheduled for the 3rd week of May," he said. "Webb is confident. The preliminary upheld the challenge. The fraudulent assignment is suspended, which means Caldwell's purchase offer has no legal basis to stand on." He sat down on the step beside her, leaving a proper distance between them, though he was aware of the distance precisely because he was aware of her. "You may have to go back to the county seat, but Webb believes the outcome will be in your favor. And Prout, he will face a separate proceeding on the fraud charge," David said. "That is out of my jurisdiction, but it is in motion." She nodded slowly, turning her teacup in both hands. The evening was warm, with a light wind coming from the south, and the windmill was turning steadily with its slow, familiar sound. The sky to the west was the color of embers. "I keep thinking about what would have happened," she said, "if I had not heard him in that store, if I had just taken my flour and gone home and not known until it was too late to fight it." "But you did hear him," David said. "I heard him because I fainted," she said, with a short, rueful sound that was close to laughter. "Which is a deeply undignified way to accidentally save your own property." "It was not so undignified," he said. She glanced at him. "I fell on the floor of August Calloway's store." "Before that," he said, "I meant the hearing part and the statement and the rest of it." She was quiet for a moment. "I have thought about the way you stayed," she said very carefully, looking at the horizon rather than at him. "That first day, you fixed the door latch and you fixed the bucket rope and you stayed." He did not say anything. "You did not have to do any of that," she said. "I know," he said. Another silence, longer, the kind that had weight to it. "Why did you?" she asked. He considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because leaving felt wrong," he said simply. "Because you were here and you were carrying too much alone and leaving felt like the wrong thing to do." He paused. "And because I did not want to leave." She turned and looked at him then, and the setting sun was on her face and her gray eyes were very clear, and she did not look away. "I am glad you did not," she said. It was not a declaration. It was smaller than that and more honest, and it reached him more completely than any declaration could have. He did not move toward her, did not do anything that would make the moment into something she was not yet ready for. He just let it be what it was, held it carefully, and after a while she looked back at the horizon and he did too, and they sat together on the porch steps in the fading evening until the stars came out one by one. He rode back to town in the full dark with the stars very bright overhead and a feeling in his chest that he did not try to analyze. Some things were better understood slowly. The full hearing at the county seat took place on the 21st of May, 1882. Marcus Webb argued with a precision and thoroughness that made clear why David had written to him specifically, laying out the evidence of the fraudulent inducement in detail, presenting the material misrepresentations Prout had made to Hester, and the deliberate concealment of the document's nature. He introduced witnesses, including August Calloway, who had overheard parts of Prout's conversation in the store and was willing to testify to it, and a former client of Prout's from a neighboring county who had experienced a nearly identical scheme 3 years prior. Franklin Caldwell was represented by a lawyer from Austin who was technically skilled but was working with a fundamentally weak case, and the hearing judge, a man named Harlan Foster who had been on the territorial bench for 12 years and who had seen every variety of land fraud the territory could produce, was not impressed by technically skilled arguments in defense of fundamentally weak cases. The fraudulent assignment was voided. The purchase offer that Caldwell had filed based on that assignment was declared without legal basis. The Hawkins land was confirmed in Hester's name under the original deed filed by Thomas Hawkins in 1871. Hester was sitting beside Marcus Webb at the respondent's table when Judge Foster delivered the ruling, and David was sitting in the gallery behind her, and he watched the line of her shoulders change, very subtly, as she absorbed the words. The held, careful tension that had lived in her posture for 3 months released by some small degree, and he saw her take a breath that went all the way down. She turned to look at him after Webb shook her hand, and her face was doing something she was not entirely managing to control, a brightness that was partly relief and partly something more complicated and entirely human. He smiled, which was not something he did very often and was usually only partial when it happened, but this time it came out complete, and she blinked at the sight of it as if it had caught her by surprise. They rode back to Redrock that evening, she and David, with Webb following behind at a slight distance and occupying himself with the professional satisfaction of a man who has won a case he believed in. The road back was the same road they had ridden a month before, when she had told him about coming around the bend in the stagecoach and knowing that the valley was where she was meant to be. It was evening again, the same deep blue settling in from the east, and the mesquite was in bloom, small yellow flowers against the dry scrub, and the smell of it was particular and sweet. She said, somewhere in the middle of the ride, "I do not know how to thank you properly." "You do not need to thank me," he said. "I do," she said. "You wrote to Webb, you went to Caldwell, you kept watch on this whole situation when it was not strictly your responsibility. She paused, choosing words with her characteristic care. "You made it possible for me to keep my father's land." "Webb made it possible," he said. "The law made it possible." "You started the law moving in the right direction," she said. "That matters." He did not argue further because she was not entirely wrong, and arguing with Hester Hawkins when she was not wrong was an exercise with a predictable outcome. After a moment she said, more quietly, "I am not just talking about the land." He looked at her. She was looking forward at the road, and the evening light was in her hair and on the side of her face, and there was a vulnerability in her expression that was all the more affecting for how rarely he saw it. "I know," he said. The word "I know" carried a great deal of freight, and she received it that way, and the silence afterward was not an empty one. Webb departed for Laredo the morning after the hearing, paid in full, and with a genuine warmth in his leave-taking that suggested he found the situation personally as well as professionally satisfying. He shook David's hand and told him to give his regards to the territorial court system, which was Webb's dry way of saying that the right side had won. He shook Hester's hand and told her the land was hers to keep and to work and to pass on, and she thanked him with the quiet dignity that she brought to everything she meant. Gerald Prout, facing the fraud charges, made a deal with the territorial prosecutor. He provided testimony against Franklin Caldwell in exchange for a reduced sentence, which meant that Caldwell faced legal proceedings of his own over his orchestration of the fraud scheme. Caldwell's lawyer from Austin was considerably less effective without a weak case to hide behind, and Caldwell ultimately paid a substantial fine and was barred from land transactions in the territory for 5 years. It was not the most severe possible outcome, but it was real, and it was public, and it meant that the architecture of the scheme was exposed and documented in the territorial record, which made it considerably harder to repeat. Hester heard about this from David on a morning in early June, sitting on the porch with coffee, and she absorbed it with a long, quiet exhale that contained a great deal. "It is over, then," she said. "It is over," he confirmed. She looked out at the 40 acres, at the scrubland and the mesquite and the limestone outcroppings and the creek glinting in the morning sun, and her expression was something very close to peace. "My father worked this land for 11 years, she said. "He broke his back on it, and he loved it, and he built that fence line with his own hands." She turned and looked at David. He would have been so angry. "About Prout. About all of it," she said. And then he would have been satisfied about the outcome. He was not a man who stayed angry past the resolution of a thing. She paused. "I think I am like him in that way." "I think you are," David agreed. She was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands in the habit he had come to recognize. "What happens now for you?" she asked. "With this resolved?" He understood the question. She was asking carefully whether his daily presence on the creek road had been solely professional and whether, the professional matter being concluded, it would cease. He looked at her steadily. "I was not coming out here every morning because of the legal case," he said. Her eyes met his. "I know," she said. "I was asking anyway." "I am going to keep coming," he said, "if that is all right with you." She held his gaze for a moment, and something in her face opened in a way he had been watching for gradually over the weeks, like a door that has been locked for a long time and opens by degrees. "It is all right with me," she said. He nodded once, and that was enough. The summer of 1882 in Redrock, Texas, was hot in the way that West Texas summers are always hot, which is to say thoroughly and without apology. The creek ran lower and the dust rose higher, and the sky was a pale, bleached blue that looked like it had been left out in the sun too long. But the Hawkins place had shade from the old cottonwood trees along the creek bank, and the garden that had been going to weeds when Hester arrived in winter was now producing tomatoes and beans and squash in a satisfying abundance. David rode out every morning, which was the established fact of his life. He stayed for coffee and usually for breakfast, and on many days he stayed through the morning hours, helping with the practical work of the property. The fence line that had been cut on the northern edge was repaired thoroughly. The frayed bucket rope was replaced. A section of the barn roof that had been sagging was reinforced. None of this was formally assigned. None of it was discussed as obligation. It was simply the natural consequence of two people who wanted to be in each other's company, finding productive ways to occupy the hours they spent together. The town of Redrock watched this development with the frank and cheerful interest that small towns bring to the romantic affairs of their residents. August Calloway, who had a particular stake in the matter given that it had originated in his store, was heard to express satisfaction on multiple occasions. The widow Beatrice Horn, who ran the millinery and who had appointed herself the social chronicler of Redrock, told anyone who would listen that it was about time the marshal settled himself, that a man could not live on professional purpose alone, and that Hester Hawkins was exactly the sort of woman who would be good for him. The deputy, a young man of 22 named Tom Garrett, asked David with the unsubtle directness of youth whether he intended to court Miss Hawkins formally, and received a look in return that answered the question thoroughly enough that Tom did not ask it again. The courtship was not dramatic in its outward form. It was built of mornings and conversations and shared labor and the slow, deepening pleasure of knowing someone better and better. It was built of the particular way Hester looked when she was reading, tucked into the corner of the settee with her feet pulled up and a book tilted toward the window light, and the way she argued with him about things she cared about, which was often, and which he had come to actively enjoy because she was usually right and always interesting. It was built of the way he made her laugh, not frequently but genuinely, and the way she looked when it happened, as if she had surprised herself. He told her his history more fully as the summer progressed, in the way that people tell things gradually, offering pieces when the moment feels right rather than all at once. He told her about his childhood in Missouri, about his father who had been a stern and decent man, and his mother who had died when David was 9, and the years between that loss and becoming a lawman that he did not talk about much because they had been years of uncertain purpose and displacement that he had eventually found his way through, but did not look back on with pleasure. He told her about the man he had killed in Fort Worth, a violent drunk who had taken a knife to 2 people before David intervened, and how the necessity of it had changed something in him about the nature of the job, had made him understand that the star on his chest was not ceremonial. She listened to all of it without flinching. She asked questions that showed she had understood the weight of what he was sharing. She did not offer easy comfort or unnecessary consolation. She met the difficult parts directly, which was what he needed, which was exactly Hester. She told him about the years between leaving Redrock as a girl of 12, when her mother had taken her to San Antonio after her parents separated, and returning as a woman of 26 to bury her father. She told him about the distance that had grown between her and her mother, who had remarried and had a new family, and who had regarded Hester's independence with a mixture of pride and slight bewilderment. She told him about the loneliness of being very capable and very self-sufficient in a world that frequently interpreted those qualities in a woman as obstacles to connection rather than strengths. She told him about the 2 men who had courted her in San Antonio and the reason she had not accepted either of them, which had less to do with those men specifically than with the fact that she had never felt with either of them that she was being seen accurately. "You see people accurately," she said to him one afternoon in July, sitting under the cottonwood by the creek with the water low and slow beside them. "It is not a common quality. You make it easier than most," he said. She looked at him with that direct, clear look. "How? You are honest," he said. "You do not perform things you do not feel. You do not hide things with unnecessary words. You let what is real be visible." He paused. It is easier to see accurately when a person is not obscuring themselves. She was quiet for a long moment, and the creek moved beside them with its low, unhurried sound. "I have been lonely for a long time," she said, and it was one of the most unguarded things she had said to him, offered plainly without apology or decoration. "So have I," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The afternoon light filtered green and gold through the cottonwood leaves, and somewhere down the creek, a meadowlark was singing with the casual, unself-conscious beauty that meadowlarks bring to West Texas summers. He reached over and took her hand where it lay in the grass beside her. She turned her palm up and held his hand, and they sat there under the cottonwood tree by the low creek in the summer afternoon, and neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing else to say, because everything essential had been communicated, and the rest would happen in its own time. He asked her in August. He had thought about how to do it, which was not something he usually thought about, and had concluded that elaborate staging was not in keeping with who they were to each other, that she would not want anything that felt theatrical, that she would want what was honest and real. He came out on a Tuesday morning in late August with his good coat on instead of his usual work jacket, which she noticed immediately with a slight lift of her eyebrows. They had coffee on the porch as always, and he was quieter than usual, which she also noticed, and she waited, patient and attentive, because she could read him by now almost as well as he could read her. After a while he said, "I would like to ask you something." "Then ask," she said. "I want to marry you," he said. Not as a thing that would solve a practical problem, or provide a legal protection, or any of the reasons a woman in your situation might consider marrying. "I want to marry you because you are the person I want to be with, because I have been coming out here every morning for 4 months and I have not found a single morning that I regretted it, because I think we are good together and I think we would be good together for a long time." He stopped. "That is the ask." She held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at him for a long, clear moment. Her gray eyes were very steady and very warm. "Yes," she said, "just yes." Clean and complete and entirely Hester. He exhaled slowly, and she made a sound that was almost laughter at the exhale, as if she were suggesting that he had known the answer and had been anxious anyway, which was accurate. "When?" she asked. "As soon as you want," he said. "October," she said. "That gives us time to do it properly." They were married in October 1882 in the small Methodist church on Redrock's Main Street by a minister named Reverend Arthur Gaines, who had come out from back east 3 years prior and had found the frontier considerably more spiritually eventful than he had anticipated. August Calloway stood witness for David. Hester had written to a woman named Clara Dean, who had been her closest friend from her teaching years in San Antonio, and Clara had made the journey by stage and stood beside her at the altar with an expression of profound satisfaction that said she had suspected something like this would happen and was very glad to have been right. Hester wore a dress she had made herself from the best fabric Calloway's general store could provide, a deep blue-gray that was exactly the color of her eyes in low light, and she wore her hair pinned up with the small ivory combs that had been her mother's. She looked, David thought, as he watched her walk down the aisle of the small church with the morning sun coming through the windows, like someone who has found the place they are supposed to be and settled into it fully. She looked certain and steady and more beautiful than he had words for. He would try to find the words later. He would find them, eventually, imperfectly, in the small daily moments that accumulate into a life. She said her vows in her clear, precise voice, and he said his in his quiet, deliberate one, and Reverend Gaines pronounced them married with an enthusiasm that suggested he had found officiating a happy marriage considerably more rewarding than the other varieties, and the small congregation of Redrock residents who had gathered clapped with the genuine warmth of a community that approves of an outcome. Tom Garrett, David's deputy, threw his hat in the air. The reception was held in the church hall, with food contributed by half a dozen families in town, and music from a fiddler named Pete Alvarez, who played with a skill and energy that had people dancing on the flagstone floor for 3 hours. Hester danced with David in the way that people dance when they have not danced together before, but move well enough together that it does not matter, finding the rhythm jointly, adjusting naturally, which felt like a reasonable metaphor for everything else about them. Clara Dean pulled Hester aside at one point and told her with tremendous directness that she was radiantly happy, and that it suited her very well, and that David Hadley had better know what he had. Hester told Clara that she believed he did, and Clara looked across the room at David, who was talking with August Calloway with the relaxed quality of a man at ease in the world, and said yes, she supposed he did. They spent the first night at the Hawkins place, which was their place now, and the next morning David went into his office in Redrock and formally updated his residential address with the territorial records, and moved what personal belongings he had accumulated in the rented room above the hardware store out to the homestead. He did not have a great many belongings, which Hester noted with an expression that said she found this understandable but intended to change it, and she began in small ways over the following weeks, adding things to the house that made it more fully inhabited, more fully theirs. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was quiet in the way that good winters are quiet, full and warm inside while the weather worked outside, and they were genuinely happy in it, which is a thing worth saying directly because it is not always the case that people who have been drawn together by crisis discover that they are also well suited to ordinary life. But they were. They were good at ordinary life together. They had an easy rhythm in the domestic details, a natural division of labor that neither of them had designed or discussed, but that had simply settled into place, and they talked in the evenings by the fire with the same quality of genuine interest that had characterized their conversations from the beginning. She was teaching again by spring, having arranged with the town of Redrock to take over the schoolroom that had been without a permanent teacher for over a year. The children were a range of ages and backgrounds and frontier-specific personalities, and she met all of them with the same direct, interested attention she brought to everything. And within 2 months, the school had a reputation in the community as a place where a child was genuinely educated rather than merely occupied. David watched this with a pride he did not always know how to express, but that came out sideways in small ways. In the way he talked about her at the office, in the way he made sure the school building had a new door hinge in November when the old one broke, in the way he picked her up from the schoolhouse on evenings when the weather was turning. She was pregnant by the following April. They had hoped for it, had talked about it with the careful optimism of two people who understand that hoping for things does not guarantee them. And when she told him on a Tuesday evening in the kitchen with the lamp lit, and the supper things still on the table, his face did something that she would describe later to Clara Dean as the most unguarded expression she had ever seen on a man who was habitually very guarded, and she loved him fiercely for it. The baby came in December of 1883, which turned out to be a boy. He was healthy and loud, and had a fine set of lungs that he exercised with conviction, and they named him Thomas David Hadley. Thomas for the grandfather he would never meet, and David for the father he was only beginning to know. The naming made Hester cry a little, which was one of the very few times David saw her cry, and he held her in the low light of the bedroom with the baby between them and understood, with a completeness that had no language for it, what it was to have built something real. Tom Garrett, David's deputy, became godfather with an enthusiasm that suggested he had been wanting this responsibility for some time. August Calloway brought a crate of supplies to the homestead that was so thoroughly stocked it bordered on the extravagant. Clara Dean, who had settled in Redrock in the autumn and taken a position with the local women's society, came to see the baby and held him with an expertise that surprised Hester until Clara explained that she was one of 7 children and had been holding babies since she was 5. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was harder than the previous one. There was a harsh stretch in January and February that kept everyone close to their fires, and a sickness that moved through the town in late February that took several of the older residents and frightened everyone. David and Hester both worked through it in their respective roles, she keeping the school running with whatever children could safely attend and contributing to the care of sick neighbors, he managing the additional strains that crisis puts on a community, the disputes that arise from fear, the people who behave badly under pressure, the ordinary maintenance of order that becomes significantly less ordinary when the ordinary has been disrupted. They were tired through much of that winter. But they were tired together, which is a different thing from being tired alone, and at the end of each long day there was the fire and the baby and the familiar warmth of a home that was genuinely theirs. By spring the sickness had passed, and the town had recovered its equilibrium. David had added a second deputy, a man named Carl Bryce who had come down from Kansas with recommendations from 2 different marshals, and who proved to be exactly what he appeared to be, which David was grateful for because, in his experience, that was not always how it went. The addition meant he could spend more time at the homestead, which the homestead required, because 40 acres is a great deal of land for two people to manage alongside full professional lives, and they had been managing it with a combination of hard work and the help of a young man named Eli Torres who lived in town and came out several days a week. Eli was 17 and the son of a Mexican family who had been in the territory longer than most of the Anglo settlers, which gave them a history in the land that was often overlooked and occasionally actively disrespected by the more recent arrivals. David, who had no patience for the various performances of superiority that passed for social currency on the frontier, treated Eli and his family with the direct, uncomplicated respect he extended to anyone he found worthy of it, which in Eli's case was founded on the observation that the young man was reliable, intelligent, and worked with an integrity that many people twice his age did not match. Hester had the same view, and in addition had taken to tutoring Eli in the evenings 2 nights a week, as he had limited formal schooling and a clear aptitude that had not been given adequate opportunity to develop. By the summer of 1884, Eli could read and calculate at a level that exceeded many of the adults in the community, and he had begun to talk about the possibility of formal study, which Hester encouraged with a precision and seriousness that Eli clearly found both daunting and galvanizing. The summer was abundant. The garden produced lavishly. The cattle were well. Thomas, who was 6 months old and then 7 months old and then suddenly it was August and he was 8 months old, and pulling himself upright on the furniture with an expression of furious concentration that was immediately recognizable as his father's, developed a personality that was already clearly its own, opinionated and curious, and given to states of complete absorption in whatever had most recently captured his attention. Hester watched him in these absorbed states with an expression of such unguarded love that David, watching her watch the baby, felt the fact of his life as something very full and very specific, not an abstraction of happiness, but the actual, particular thing. This woman and this child and this house and these 40 acres in the West Texas sun. Franklin Caldwell left the territory in mid-1884, following the completion of his legal proceedings, and his ranch was sold off in pieces to various buyers. Gerald Prout served a reduced sentence and was released in late summer, and was seen on the road south shortly afterward, destination unknown and unmourned. The legal record stood. The fraudulent scheme was documented. The Hawkins land, Thomas Hadley's land now too, was secure. On the first anniversary of their wedding, in October 1883, David gave Hester a new copy of the land deed, framed in a simple wooden frame he had made himself, with both their names on it as joint holders of the homestead, as the law now permitted, and as he had requested from the Territorial Records Office as soon as it was possible to do so. She looked at it for a long time without speaking, and then she looked at him, and what was in her face was the deep, particular recognition of being known in the way that matters most. She gave him a pocket watch, which was a fine one from a maker in San Francisco that she had ordered by mail 3 months in advance, and that had his initials engraved on the case. He carried it every day. He still carried it, in the way that people carry the objects that are given with genuine love, with the understanding that the object is holding something that cannot otherwise be handed from one person to another. Their second child came in March of 1885, a girl this time, with her mother's gray eyes and a quantity of dark hair that prompted Reverend Gaines to remark at the baptism that she had arrived fully equipped. They named her Margaret Clara Hadley, Margaret for David's mother and Clara for Hester's closest friend, who stood as godmother with a speechlessness that lasted approximately 4 minutes before she collected herself and made a toast at the small gathering afterward that was funny and warm and moved several people to tears. Thomas, who was 15 months old and navigating the world with the focused intensity of someone who has recently discovered that locomotion is a possibility, regarded his sister with initial suspicion that gradually, over the following weeks, became a proprietary interest that expressed itself in a constant desire to be in her immediate vicinity. Hester and David found this both touching and practically inconvenient, as it required continuous monitoring, and the days became full in a new way, the particular fullness of a household with two small children, which is to say noisy and tiring and intermittently chaotic and profoundly, warmly, completely alive. David Hadley, sitting on the porch of the Hawkins homestead on a September evening in 1885, with the windmill turning in the evening breeze, and the sound of his children from inside the house and his wife reading in the chair beside him with her feet tucked up in her old habit, allowed himself to look back across the years to the day he had walked into Callaway's general store and caught a woman before she hit the floor, and to track the direct, unbroken line from that moment to this one. He had not expected this. He had come to Redrock because it needed a marshal, and because somewhere without his knowing it had felt like a place that might be his, and it had turned out to be more exactly his than he had been prepared for, in ways that he could not have designed or predicted. He had thought, at 31, that he was a man who had found his work and his purpose, and that this was sufficient, and it had turned out to be insufficient in a way he had not understood until it stopped being insufficient. Hester looked up from her book and found him looking at her. "What?" she said, with the slight self-consciousness of someone caught being observed. "Nothing," he said, "just looking." She held his gaze for a moment, and then the corner of her mouth moved in the particular way that was her version of a smile when she was not bothering to construct one for an audience. "You are a very strange man, David Hadley," she said. "You keep telling me that," he said. "It keeps being true," she said, and went back to her book, and he went back to the evening, and the windmill turned, and the stars came out. And inside the house, their son and daughter were making the sounds of children who are loved and certain of it. And the 40 acres that Thomas Hawkins had broken out of the Texas scrubland 11 years before were dark and quiet and whole under the wide, indifferent, beautiful sky. The years that followed were years of building. They built the house out by another room in the spring of 1886, because 2 small children and a household of working adults required more space than the original structure had been designed to provide. David built most of it himself on weekends and in the long summer evenings, with Eli Torres helping on the heavier work and an older carpenter from town named James Whitfield who came out for the framing and pronounced the walls straight and the corners square, which David received as the compliment it was. Hester watched the addition go up with a domestic satisfaction she did not try to conceal, and when it was done, she painted the window frames herself in a particular shade of white that she had been specific about, and moved the children into the new room and converted the old sleeping space into a study, with a desk under the window and bookshelves along one wall. She filled the bookshelves with a deliberateness that David found pleasurable to observe, because watching Hester do anything with full attention was pleasurable, and the arrangement of books was something she did with the seriousness it deserved. Thomas started school in the autumn of 1887 and was immediately recognizable to his mother's colleagues as a child who would either be a joy or a challenge, depending entirely on whether he was engaged, which she told David with a rueful affection that said she knew she had contributed to this quality and accepted the consequence. Margaret, who was 2.5 and had developed opinions about most aspects of her existence, watched Thomas leave for school with an expression of outrage that her brother was going somewhere she could not go. She told Hester, in the direct way that she had developed remarkably early, that she would also like to go to school. Hester told her that she would in 2 years. Margaret considered this for a moment and then said that 2 years was too many years, which was a reasonable assessment that did not change the timeline but was noted. David received a letter in February of 1888 from the territorial governor's office, which came via the county seat and had an official seal. The letter offered him the position of Deputy Territorial Marshal for the Western District, which was a significant promotion with a larger jurisdiction and a substantially increased salary. He held it for 2 days without mentioning it to Hester, turning it over in his mind, and then he told her about it at breakfast on a Thursday morning and watched her face move through the information. "What do you want to do?" She asked not what will we do or what should we do, but the direct, practical question that assumed his agency and her interest in his answer. "I want to know what you think," he said. "I asked you first," she said. He looked at his coffee cup for a moment. The position would mean more travel, more time away from here. He looked up at her. "I do not want more time away from here." She considered this. "The salary would make a difference," she said. "We are not in difficulty," he said. "No," she said, "but it is never," she paused, choosing her words. "It is never a simple thing for a woman to have no income of her own. The teaching pays, but it does not pay much. A better household income would mean I had more choices." She met his eyes. "I am not telling you to take it. I am telling you honestly what the consideration is." He thought about it for 3 more days. He wrote back to the governor's office with a counter-proposal, asking whether the position could be structured to allow him to maintain his primary residence in Redrock, and to limit the travel requirements to cases that required his specific attention, rather than general patrol of the district. The governor's office responded after a delay of 2 weeks that this arrangement was unusual but acceptable, given his record. He took the position on those terms. The increased salary was, as Hester had said, a difference. She used a portion of it to expand the school's resources, to purchase additional books and materials, and negotiated with the town council to hire an assistant teacher, which allowed her to serve a larger number of students more effectively, and which she described to David with the satisfaction of a person who has been constrained by resources for some time and has finally been given room to move. Eli tours, with Hester's encouragement and a letter of recommendation from David that detailed his abilities and character with the precision of a man who meant every word, was accepted to a commercial college in Fort Worth in the autumn of 1888. The Torres family came out to the Hadley homestead for a dinner to celebrate, and the evening had a warmth and abundance about it that came not only from the food, but from the genuine affection between the families and the particular satisfaction of seeing a young person with talent find the door that was meant for them. David shook Eli's hand at the end of the evening and said he expected to hear good things, which was his way of saying he was proud, and Eli understood it and said he intended to provide them, and they both knew they meant it. The 3rd child came in the summer of 1889, another boy, whom they named James after David's grandfather, and who arrived in the world with a disposition so placid and sunny that he seemed to have been designed as a counterweight to the combined intensity of his older siblings. Thomas, who was 5½ by this time and had developed into exactly the engaged, demanding, intellectually voracious child his mother had predicted, received his new brother with a seriousness that suggested he was assessing the situation and forming conclusions. Margaret, who was 4 and had long since decided that school was if anything better than she had expected, held James for approximately 30 seconds, and then declared him satisfactory, and went back to the book she had been reading, which was advanced for her age but which she had been working through with focused determination for 2 weeks. Hester, lying in the bed with the summer heat making everything warm and heavy, watched her family occupy the bedroom around her with an expression that David recognized as the particular contentment of a person who has gotten, against considerable odds, exactly what they most needed. He sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and James slept in the crook of her arm, and she said quietly so that only he could hear it, "I thought of something." "What?" he said. "The flour sack," she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the ceiling with a faint curve at the corner of her mouth. "I dropped the flour sack," she said, "that day in Calloway's store. I left it on the floor when you carried me out. I never paid for it." He stared at her for a moment, and then he laughed, genuinely and fully, which was still the thing she loved most about making him laugh, because it was so complete and so unguarded in a man who was otherwise careful. "I will pay August for it," he said. "Please do," she said. "It has been troubling me for 7 years." He paid August Calloway for the flour sack the following week, explaining what it was for, and Calloway laughed until he had to sit down, and then told David to tell Hester that the flour sack was on the house and had been since the day it hit his floor, because he figured catching a woman before she hit his floorboards was worth at least 1 sack of flour. David told her. She told him to pay for it anyway, because she preferred accounts to be settled cleanly, and so he paid for it, and Calloway accepted the payment with the good-natured indulgence of a man who is dealing with a woman who has her principles and a man who has the sense to respect them. The town of Redrock grew through the late 1880s and into the 1890s, as towns in the territory did, as the frontier shifted and what had been rough edge became established community. A railway line came through in 1891, connecting Redrock to the larger network of Texas commerce, which changed the character of the town in ways both obvious and subtle. New businesses arrived. New families arrived. The school that Hester had taken over with 1 teacher and 100 children expanded to 3 classrooms by 1892, and she took on the role of head teacher with a combination of efficiency and genuine passion for the work that made the school one of the best in the district. David's territory expanded under the deputy marshal role, and he became known through the Western District as a man of particular competence and particular honesty, which in the territory of that era was a combination not everyone managed, and that people talked about when it was present. He handled disputes, tracked serious criminals, supported local marshals in complicated situations, and maintained the quality of transparent, purposeful practice that had characterized his work from the beginning. He was offered twice more positions in larger cities with larger salaries, and twice more he declined them, on the grounds that Redrock was his and that he had more than enough to occupy him. The homestead prospered. The 40 acres that Thomas Hawkins had broken out of the Texas scrubland were worked and productive, expanded eventually to 60 acres, with the purchase of the adjacent parcel when its owner moved north in 1892. The house had grown room by room over the years, from the original modest structure to something more substantial, still limestone and wood, still true to the land it sat on, but larger and more settled, with the accumulated presence of a family that had inhabited it fully. Thomas was 12 in 1895, a serious and demanding student who had given his mother more than one argument about points of history and grammar that she had won by the simple expedient of being right, and who had developed a passion for mechanical things, for the way machines worked and the ways they could be improved, that suggested a future David suspected would take him well beyond Redrock. Margaret was 10, reading at a level significantly beyond her age, and with an attention to justice in the classroom that made her both a help and an occasional trial to her teachers, and which made Hester quietly, fiercely proud. James was 6, still the family's sunny constant, curious and easy, learning to read with the comfortable pace of a child who does not approach things with urgency because he has never found urgency necessary. On a September evening in 1895, David and Hester sat on the porch of the homestead that had been hers, and was now theirs, and would be their children's after them, with the last of the summer warmth still in the air, and the windmill turning in its familiar way, and the cottonwood trees by the creek showing the first few yellow leaves of autumn. She had a letter in her hand that had come that day from Eli Torres, who was now 28 and running a trading company in Fort Worth that he had built from a position as a junior accountant at the commercial college into something real and growing and genuinely his. He wrote regularly, good letters full of practical detail, and the occasional observation that showed he had not lost the quality of attention that had made him stand out as a young man. He asked in every letter about the family, specifically about the children by name, and sent books periodically that he thought one or another of them would find useful, with a specificity that showed he remembered each child individually. Hester read the relevant part of the letter aloud to David, a passage in which Eli described a deal he had negotiated with a supplier in San Antonio, using a strategy of patient, respectful persistence that he said he had learned from watching a certain Marshal deal with difficult situations over the years of his youth. David listened to this with an expression that was not quite comfortable, the expression of a man who does not know how to receive certain kinds of credit, and Hester lowered the letter and looked at him with a warmth that said she knew exactly how he looked right now and found it exactly right. "You made a difference," she said simply. "We made a difference," he said. She allowed this emendation. "We," she agreed. The sun was going down behind the scrubland to the west. The same sky, the same colors, the same slow deepening into dark that had been happening over this piece of Texas for 1,000 years, and would go on happening after everyone who was currently watching it was long gone. And there was something in that continuity that was neither sad nor frightening, just spacious, just the vast, impersonal generosity of time and land that does not belong to any particular person, but that particular people can inhabit fully if they are lucky and willing and awake. David Hadley was all three. "I keep thinking about something," he said. "You think about many things," she said. "What is it this time?" "The morning I left you here," he said, "the first morning, after I had fixed the door latch and the bucket rope, I rode back to town and I thought about turning around." She looked at him. "You did not tell me that." "No," he said. "Why did you not turn around?" she asked. "Because I thought it was too soon," he said. "Because I thought you would not want me to." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the sky. "You would have been right about that," she said. Then she paused, "But I would have changed my mind." He looked at her. "I was already changing my mind," she said. "I just needed time to do it at my own pace." He reached over and took her hand, in the way he had the first time under the cottonwood tree, and she turned her palm up and held his, and they sat there in the early autumn evening while the sky changed and the first stars appeared, and somewhere in the house behind them, their children moved through the rooms they had grown up in, full of life and certainty, and the windmill turned. "I am glad I caught you," he said. She made a sound that was exactly the right amount of amusement. "I am glad I dropped the flour sack," she said. He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. The stars came out fully, one by one and then all at once, the way they do in West Texas, without ceremony, without gradation, simply present, bright and certain and there. And the Hadley homestead settled into the evening quiet with the completeness of a place that has been inhabited by people who stayed when staying mattered, who built when building was necessary, and who loved each other with the plain, durable, specific love that does not require grand gestures because it is present every morning when the coffee is already on, and every evening when there is a hand to hold on the porch steps in the September dark. And the 40 acres that Thomas Hawkins had broken out of the Texas scrubland were quiet and dark and whole, and above them the sky went on forever, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.